Hi, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about we'll take a closer look at Essential Instruction Practice 3, where we really need to be thinking about how we're providing time for small group instruction and one-on-one instruction in our classroom. And one of the big challenges that we find is, what do we do with everyone else? How do we keep everyone meaningfully engaged so that we can free ourselves up to this really important intentional teaching in small group and individual instruction? So I've put together a few photos and some slides for you to think about what you might be able to offer your students so they are meaningfully engaged and not just going through the motions of doing a task to keep them busy. So the first thing that we need to do is think about how you're going to actually have the students know what is expected of them. And in fact, what do great readers do? Or if you're doing this in writing, what do great writers do? So to build agency and engagement, we need to talk to the children about what great readers do, about the strategic actions that they take during their reading. So making charts about what you do as a reader and how you are actively engaging with the text. You need to make visible the sources of information in the text that support an emergent reader. So modelling during your mini lesson in a reader's workshop, showing them how to turn the pages, how we notice illustrations, diagrams, and information in the text. We might notice that headings are in bold. We might notice that the contents page at the beginning gives us some information about what's going to happen. We might talk about the front cover and make some predictions about what do we think this book is going to be about, so that they're activating their schema. So thinking about how are you working with all your learners about making visible those sources of information in a text that support them, in addition to, of course, the letter-sound relationships that you would be teaching them. Have routines so children know what is expected. So when I'm working with my small group, that my students actually know where they need to go and what behaviours is expected of them. So that needs to be a routine that is practiced. And in that routine, we will encourage student self-regulation, where they are able to actively engage in a text and talk with others about what they're expected to do, or in fact know what they're expected to do without having to come and interrupt the intentional teaching group. So to do this, you're going to need some resources. We need to provide access and choice to our young readers, or to all readers. So you might want to spend some time talking about a good fit book. And if you'd like some more information on that, Debbie Miller's book, Reading with Meaning, has a great chapter on talking about good fit books with your students. You need to create a place where students can keep the books that they choose and that you have worked with them as guided choice as well. Remember that we can have student choice, but there's also going to be guided choice in a children's book box, so that or a place that they're going to keep these books that is readily accessible. So when you say it's time to go and read, they're actually able to go and access these books without too much interruption. In that box, we'll talk in a moment about what would be in that box, but importantly, there will be texts from their previous lesson with you, that mini lesson or guided reading or guided instruction. The books that they've interacted with you as a teacher need to go into this box so that they are there for them to practice. But along with that will be other quality texts that the students have carefully selected themselves. And on the screen, you can see the variety of books that were in children's book boxes that I randomly photographed last week. What else might you have in the book box? Well, you might have a bookmark. So if children are able to leave in the book where they were up to. But in that bookmark, you might have, on the bookmark, you might also have some sticky notes, so that when you set a task around, think about a question that's come to mind when you've been reading your book, that the children might just place a sticky note on that page, or a word that was tricky for you to read, the sticky note goes on the page. So children don't need to be really fluent in writing to be able to use a sticky note to identify something in their reading that you might share later in your share time in your readers workshop. You might have a comprehension strategy that you want your students to be focusing on in their reading, and that would be like a little bookmark here, like this reminds me of, or a text that made me think about, this book made me think about this other text. Or it might be a sticky note that the child will put a sticky note where they inferred from the pictures about how the character was feeling. So think about how you will have these resources readily available in the box. You might have class-made texts. For your emergent readers, class-made texts make a fabulous, familiar text for them to practice their reading and growing reading skills. So here's an example of I went walking, what did I see, that students have made. You might put your books that you've made, like this one where it says flock is an onset and rhyme book, where they've been learning about letter sound relationships and how we can remove the onset, those consonants before the vowel, and make other words. And so the child's made a flip book that could go in there. You might be talking about nursery rhymes and singing familiar songs. So put them on an A4 page, laminate them, and pop them in their reading box. So they have these texts where their schema is already activated, which is going to support them in their process of learning to read, along with the quality text that they choose, or that in guided choice, and also the text that they may have read with you in guided reading or some other small group or individual activity. So these boxes need to be carefully tended and talked about and valued by the teacher and the reader. Now, as you would know, this session's not about the Reader's Workshop. You can view another session on the workshop model, but just to remind you that before you would release the children to independence while you're going to work with a small group, you will have had a mini lesson or a focused lesson of some kind around what reading behaviours or strategies children will be focusing on that day, or some children will be focusing on that day, but all children would be part of that mini lesson, so that they know that the mini lesson is going to equip them with a strategy that they'll not only use in their maybe practice in the Reader's Workshop on their own books today, but whenever they need it when they're reading. And during this time, we also need to convey to our young learners that we have every confidence in them as a learner and that they will be successful because we've provided sufficient scaffold and familiarity with the text and opportunities to practice with those texts that they'll meet at this time. If you're not sure about what you need to be teaching in your mini lessons and in your small group instruction, then you might want to familiarise yourself with the learning progressions, the literacy learning progressions, and all of the important strategies, knowledge and skills that they talk about. Because remember that reading is a complex behaviour. The reader needs to be active. This diagram on the screen now is a very new diagram released by Nell Duke and her colleague Kelly Cartwright, just published last month in the International Literacy Association Journal. And she talks about the active view of reading because it reminds us of the complexity of reading and the many components that we need to address in our instruction. So, reading is always impacted by the text, the task, and the contents. And all these point to things that we need to consider when we're planning our instruction for whole class, small group, or individual. So that all of this active view of reading that you can see on the screen here is all within the context of the text, the task, and the sociocultural context, which we, of course, set up in our classroom. So having thought carefully about your planning and you're moving to small group instruction, I have this little target here to remind you that these arrows are really where, if this is the learning target and maybe at standard that we want our children to reach, and some children are already above, is that every child needs to have a chance to be reaching that at standard. And without small group and individual instruction, that won't happen. So this arrow is what our aim is as well, to help all children meet our learning target and, of course, our expectations for their particular year level. So when you're planning your small group instruction, you're going to explicitly teach something that those students need to know. You're going to give them an opportunity to apply that strategy or knowledge to actual reading or writing in a writing workshop. And then you're going to wrap up or review what was just taught. Now, that might be small group here where children are actually reading a similar text or the same text. Remember that during a guided reading session like this, the children need to be doing the reading. You will be explaining, maybe having a conversation before they begin reading, and then stopping and having another conversation at the end of one page and talking about the strategy they used or words that how they slid through the word to help them to work out what that particular word said. Or you might be doing some explicit letter sound relationships if that's what the children need practice in to support them with their reading, and then you would release them to go and do some more reading of perhaps some familiar text or a text, an alliterative text that you've created with them about that letter sound relationship. So this is what the children might be doing when they're working with you in your intentional teaching. But so what are all of the other students doing? Well, they need to be released to read with intention or work towards that reading, because we know that this is one of the challenges of what do we do with children who aren't reading independently. So we follow text-based tasks that emerge. We're going to look at some text-based tasks that emergent readers could be involved in during this time. You might like to add these to your repertoire. I'm sure you already have many that involve reading. Remember, we want the students to be actually reading during this time or working towards reading, not filling in worksheets or less effective tasks. Time on text is important. So we'll be exploring how we can vary the text, the task, and the context to provide the necessary practice that readers require. Firstly, some students will be reading from their carefully orchestrated book boxes that we've just talked about, with a focus on the instruction, maybe from the mini lesson that you led before. Others will be reading maybe repeated reading, where you've actually got a book, familiar text that we talked about, songs, rhymes, class-made texts, that they're a favourite text that they're going to read. They'll have heard it before and they'll be reading. They might be reading the pictures. They might be reading through the refrains that they know, but they'll be engaged in that repeated reading process. You might have other students where there's echo reading, and that's reading with a more able reader, and the reader, the striving reader follows along. They both have the same text and they follow along just a moment behind that more able reader as they're practicing their reading. A dyad or partner reading, we'll look at that on the next slide, but it's a very important process that you might want to think about. And also retelling wordless picture books. So retelling any story, but that's an excellent rehearsal for the thinking that is required for reading. But wordless picture books, children are not just retelling the story, they're actually creating the story as well. So that's something that students can be actively engaged in that process. The partner reading or dyad reading means that children are read with others, and it's a great opportunity for peers to provide support for one another in that collaborative and productive manner. So the students, or it can be an adult, can share one book, and that if they're sharing one book, they sit side by side so they both can see the words, and they both read the book aloud together, tracking with one finger beneath the text as they read, and they keep their eyes on the words. A more experienced reader reads a fraction faster than the emergent reader. You might use electronic text, so read along with a text on the iPad, as you can see the child doing here. This is a great way to practice text so that they can actually hear the text being read to them. And it's very helpful so that the students can hear someone else reading that text. An extension of that idea might be that a child would actually read the text to their iPad, and then they upload that to Seesaw for you to listen to it another time before approving inclusion in their portfolio. Reading to iPad is a very popular thing for young children to do. Students can also share their thoughts about the text and their ideas on that iPad. This image is a child reading a class-made digital text. So they've used iMovie or other text production apps, and they're now rereading and enjoying that class-made book that was made together collaboratively in a digital format. Children could be reading familiar texts of their own choice, but also texts that provide practice for the familiar letter-sound relationships that they've been exploring in their phonics lessons. And so that's an important part for them to be able to find those words and to practice looking closely and analysing, looking right through a word as they're reading. They might be rereading a shared text, such as a big book, and sharing that together and enjoying the repeated refrains and remembering the story as it was read to them by someone else. Some students could have their books from their book box, so rereading a familiar text, but their task might be to find words or letters that have been the class teaching focus. They might mark the letters on an alphabet chart. You can see just here in the corner an alphabet chart. Or they might, as these children are, find those letters once they've looked for the focus letter in their book. They've circled it on their alphabet chart. They're now going to find them. Notice they're lowercase letters in the rice or whatever other material you have in your classroom. So linking your letter-sound relationship work to the noticing that children might do in their early reading texts, then to noticing that letter again on that alphabet chart, and then finding it again in another location will really build their knowledge of letter-sound relationships. They might go for a hunt in their book for a word or a letter. Here's an example that I took in the classroom just last week. We're in a kindergarten classroom where the children were talking about the letter P, representing at the beginning of pig, and many other words that they had brainstormed. And this is that children were using their sticky notes to record some of the words they had found in the familiar texts that were in their textbook, in their book boxes. Children could use the whiteboard I didn't mention before. You would have a little mini whiteboard in each of these boxes, and children could use that whiteboard to practice writing this letter that they have been searching for, and the one that has been the focus of a phonics instruction that was happening previously. Children might be rereading class-made books or familiar big books. This is a wonderful thing to be doing. You saw in a previous image children reading them together. This offers you a place where you can have children in an opportunity for children to be in different places in the classroom as they're reading. So some children might be actually in the library corner in a place where you've got the book stand for a big book, so that children are not all sitting at their table necessarily during this reading time. And when they're rereading the big book, then they might be looking at something that's been the focus of your mini lesson, like practicing sliding through the word, rereading, finding a familiar word, looking for a letter pattern. You can provide students with strategy instruction in the mini lesson, and then ask the student to use that strategy during their independent reading. So here's an example of a child who has their book from their book box, and they've been over time looking at text-to-text connection. They've had a sticky note for a question that's come to mind. So remembering, from reading comprehension work that we'll have done together, that reading with a question in mind helps the reader to stick to the reading. So maybe that's a task, thinking about how can you link what was in the mini lesson or your guided instruction to a meaningful task that students will be able to independently engage with. And of course, the check-in will happen at the end of the workshop when you have a few children sharing how they went with that particular task. Another idea to add to your repertoire is have children make little puppets for the characters in big books or familiar texts that you've been sharing, and leave these in places where children are asked to go at a particular time in their readers' workshop, where they can retell or reenact the story using the puppets that they have created or that you have provided, so that they go through the story together with a small group, maybe two children together, and then tell the story using their puppets. You could also extend this. So in this classroom, they'd read Dan the Flying Man, they'd enjoyed that. They'd also been doing letter sound relationships with onset and rhyme about Dan, Man, Ran, so that onset and rhyme work again. And they had opportunities in their room to be able to go to their interactive word making wall, where they could find letters and from these words and actually recreate the words. So this was a really purposeful task. They were practicing their letter sound relationships. They're practicing reading these one-syllable words with the focus letter sound relationships that were related to a text they'd read. So maybe an interactive word-making wall is something you could add to your repertoire. You can see the provocation here about word construction table. How many words can you build? And that could be around a particular task or a particular letter sound focus. These children have in their book boxes also the frequently used words that they're focusing on. So if the children are struggling with a particular frequently used words, you might write it on a card as you're conferencing with them, or have them in your small group guided instruction, and that would be kept perhaps in a Ziploc bag in their book box, so that at a time during this independent reading, they actually read those words with a partner as well. And of course, if you're lucky enough to have another adult in the room, it's really wonderful opportunity for them to have another book read to them, or to remember that to, with and by, they might be reading to this adult or with this adult, or the adult might be reading to them for a particular purpose. Remember the essential instructional practices that this adult is doing is pointing to the words as this book is being interacted with young learners, so that they are learning, maybe it's the concepts of print, that directionality. They may be focusing on a particular letter sound relationship, as well as more connected text that they might be reading at another time. So make use of the adults that are available in your room. Students might make notes about an informative text. So in your provocations in your classroom, you are placing texts. You could actually have some children go to those provocation tables and interact with the texts that you've carefully selected that are there. They might be doing some research for writing. They might be just finding out about an animal they're interested in. So think about how you can use the other spaces in your room as inviting ways to have children engage with texts and practice being a reader. So information text is often something that we forget. And as we finish this short session on thinking about what everyone else is doing while I'm taking my small group instruction, just a couple of words of advice for us to be thinking about. Beware of mindless tasks. Nell Duke has edited a whole series of books about not this, but that. They're so important that's why they've created these series. So the titles remind us. We need to reflect on, are our students meaningfully engaged in reading while you take small group instruction? Take note of who is on task and consider what might engage those who are off task. What other scaffolds do I need to do? Have I provided choice? Have I provided enough activating prior knowledge, familiarity with the text, opportunities for collaboration with a reader that is more able, or for some dyad reading? Do they have a goal so they know what it is that they're aiming for as a reader, and a purpose for their reading that might lead to engagement, such as information text? These texts that are on the screen might be useful for you if you're working in a PLC discussion group about how we can think about what are the most effective practices that we should have in our classrooms so that all students have opportunities to read every day, and not just the students who are reading with you in that small group instruction. So I wish you well as you consider how you can purposefully engage your young readers and build their identity and agency as a reader as they emerge to the success in this area. Thank you.